afternoon. Thank you, Emiko, for the introduction. I was so happy that I wasn't coming up after lunch, but then I saw I was coming after Secretary Fox, so I'm not sure which is worse. But I do want to get Rebecca and Tabitha and Councilman Dorsey up towards the stage. So I'm delighted to be here today. I have the pleasure of presenting to you the next set of speakers that will really lead the discussion around how we go from advocacy to action, and how do we develop elected officials that are political champions, but also community residents that become champions themselves, in order for us to not just get the policy win, but also have successful implementation of complete streets. I'm delighted and humbled to be here today among such a great group of advocates for equitable transportation. And before introducing the presenters, come on. I did want to just share with you just two key data points that have been part of my journey as the Health Foundation of South Florida, a local health funder, whose offices are actually across the street, and yes, I did walk, have really been trying to look at how do we address the social and the economic factors that impact health, right? How do we look at the design of communities that promote health? And we have come across a number of shocking figures, such as the fact that 85% of households in Miami-Dade County are spending more than 45% of their income just on housing and transit. And just looking at that figure, I'm wondering, why are health funders, why are public health practitioners probably not taking such a serious look at this issue of transportation? And one of the things that's also happening at the national level is this increasing trend among health funders to address these different factors, and transportation is the least invested area in the field. And I ask myself, why is that? Affordable housing has become a major issue for a lot of health funders, so has economic development, and workforce development, early education, but transportation lags behind. So I'm curious in today's presentation if we can think about what's the message here. Is it about pedestrian fatalities and reducing those? But is it also about looking at economic mobility, which is a huge issue in this region? So with that, now I'm going to go as fast as those, in the drug commercials at the end where you're going to die if you take the pill. I'm going to do my introductions. You all have that in the program book, but of course, I do want to take the time to introduce Rebecca Serna, who is the Executive Director at Atlanta Bicycle Coalition. She has a master's degree from Georgia State's Andrew Young School of Policy Studies. She was a bike ped intern with the Georgia Department of Transportation and draws on her experience as a Fulbright scholar in Bogota, Colombia. She has studied participatory planning practices and innovative public transportation projects. I then have Dr. Tabitha Decker, who is a Deputy Executive Director of TransitCenter, a national foundation working to improve public transit in ways that make cities more just, sustainable, and economically vibrant. Tabitha is a leader of the Bus Turnaround Campaign, a coalition effort that has successfully advocated for better bus service in New York City. And then last but not least, we have Councilman Ryan Dorsey, who is the city councilman for Baltimore's 3rd District. He was elected in 2016, and his accomplishments include passing a landmark complete streets ordinance, which codifies strong equity provisions and certain NACTO design standards. All of you know what NACTO means? Yes? No? I'm guessing? I had to Google it. Now I know what it is. Amending Baltimore's fire code to permit safe street design and increasing bus lane and bus stop parking fines. So please help me in welcoming, who's first? Rebecca? Yeah. Awesome. Nice to meet you. Didn't get to meet you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. So I'd like to tell you a little bit today about the many, many roles that nonprofit advocacy organizations can play when it comes to creating safe and complete streets. And there are really too many roles to fit on this slide. This is just one day of roles that we played. in one campaign. I'm going to tell you about this through the lens of a campaign for complete streets that has really dragged on for much longer than we expected in the city of Atlanta. We're still campaigning, even though we thought we won 3 years ago. And of course, because I am from Atlanta, have I already said that 5 times? That was my minimum quota for the introduction. Where boosterism is epidemic, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the city of Atlanta and our story when it comes to welcoming new modes, including scooters, to our streets. So first role that we've played is booster, of course. So 4 years ago now, in 2015, the city was contemplating a bond that would be able to pay for infrastructure improvements. We had a lot of crumbling infrastructure from our streets to public buildings, and we advocated for 15% of this funding mechanism to be spent on building complete streets projects. So we got 13.4%, and we thought we had won the day. So whoops. Nope. Can you tell me which way? All right, here we go. Thank you for bearing with me. So these were some of the messages that we conveyed during our campaign. We had a hashtag and everything. And 1/3 of public comments received during this campaign period asked for bike infrastructure. We also had a mayor who had set a very public goal of making Atlanta a top 10 city for bikes, whatever that means. So the all-powerful bike lobby that many of you are familiar with in your cities strikes again. We got the bond passed, very high numbers in the 70%, and we thought we were good. We moved on to other priorities. So then we entered our next phase, and this was what I call our cooperator phase. So you may have a bike or pedestrian advocacy organization, a livable streets advocacy organization in your city, and maybe you've invited them to join a committee. We pushed our way onto this committee, the Citizen Oversight Committee. Over time, it became the Citizen Communication Committee. And even more time passed, and it was legislated out of existence. This was 3 years later, 33 one-hour community meetings later, not that anyone's counting. And we lost 3 members to election fever as they ran for local office. And then the legislation that put us out of existence, except for one guy, he may still be meeting today by himself. I think he's in committee meeting room 2 if anyone's looking for him. So then we found ourselves 3 years in, we'd been a really good partner. Any of our disagreements or questions were made face-to-face in those committee meetings. And we realized that we were 3 years into the bond program, and none of those much-vaunted complete streets projects had been built. We did have one project sneak its way onto the list. It added sidewalks. It was in a neighborhood that did not have any projects on the list initially. So we thought, okay, one complete street project, we'll call it that. But all of the more complex projects that we had been advocating for and our members were so excited about were not getting built. So we saw the writing on the wall at this point, and we realized that we had to move into a new phase. Back to campaigning. So this became an agile campaign within a campaign, where we were calling on our members and our supporters and stakeholders to help the city prioritize this list. The other thing that happened was the city realized that the funding mechanism was only going to cover about half of the projects that it had promised. So we had an opening here, and that's where we're currently today. We're in the middle of this campaign. Luckily, we did have some good policy in place. And this is a page from Atlanta's Transportation Plan, which is our comprehensive transportation plan. It was just adopted in late 2018, something that we advocated for. And if you can see the fine print, it notes that one goal was for every member of our communities to be able to travel without having to rely so heavily on automobiles. Atlanta, like Florida, has a lot of car-centric cities. And so another goal is that we would be able to travel without dying, which I think is an excellent goal. Speaking of not dying and driving in different ways, this plan, for the very first time, sought to put biking, walking, riding transit on nearly equal footing with driving particularly when you look at driving together, rideshare, and all of the new innovations. Another aspect of the plan was a very close to Vision Zero policy, and we're still not quite on this map. Macon is on the map, and we don't hold it against them, but we're working to get Atlanta onto this Vision Zero map, and the Safer Streets policy in our comp plan gets us a lot closer to that position. It was a good thing that we had this plan adopted and that we did have some recognition that we needed safe streets in the city, because the big thing that we learned last year was that the most dangerous streets in the city of Atlanta, just 8% of our streets, accounted for 88% of our fatal crashes. That's of all types, people walking, people biking, and mostly people driving. This information shocked us, but at the same time, it wasn't all that surprising. As one of my colleagues puts it, it's all the same map. If you can see these maps, if you know Atlanta at all, the southwest part of the city is where communities of color are concentrated because of years of institutional racism, redlining. Side note, there's an excellent redlining exhibit that's been traveling the country that really shows the long-term implications of this policy. And so when I say it's all the same map, I mean that in our city, like many cities, the disparities map is the same as the map of the dangerous streets. So here our role became one of communicator. We received this research from a Georgia Tech researcher, and we were really shocked by it, and we started disseminating it and sharing that statistic with as many people as we could get to listen to us. You can see that these streets were very different from streets in other parts of the city. They were much more likely to have a majority Black population. They were much more likely to have a high percentage of people walking to work, much more likely to be riding transit, and much less likely to own cars. So if you think about this combination of factors, when you have bus headways of 40 minutes, a really high-speed, dangerous street, and a lot of people who are relying on transit to get around, you really have a dangerous street scenario adding up. So this information sparked a shift in our advocacy work, from bike lanes now to safe streets for all. And this is a reflection of the priorities of the communities that we were working in. And I think Amico mentioned earlier issues around displacement. When we were making some of the improvements that we'd been advocating for, we noticed that the population of these communities were changing. So if we're advocating for people to be able to have access to biking, walking, and safe streets, but they're being pushed out of their communities and they're not able to stay and enjoy the improvements, then we've really failed in our mission. So that's the last thing we want, and we shifted to this safe streets for all messaging and approach, and complete streets being context sensitive. So as we moved towards this more community-driven phase, we started building our coalition. And what we realized very quickly was that the AARP had all of these materials that we could have written. They were so aligned with our goals and our priorities around livable communities where people could age in place, and really the full generational gamut would be able to interact safely and get around safely in their community. So when we were advocating for the comprehensive transportation plan, we had the joy of working with our local AARP folks who actually showed up to advocate for this plan. So if you see where it says, I'm here on behalf of AARP to advocate in support of complete streets, that was really a turning point. And people were really, really pleased to see that there were more people than just the bike lobby. We also worked with the American Heart Association and similarly residents of these affected streets. So if you can see the bottom right photo, that's of a car that almost crashed into one of our members' homes. He lives on a really high-speed corridor. Tragically, another important component of our coalition is high school students whose classmate, Alexia Heineman, was killed while biking home from a school play. And they came out to advocate for complete streets in the comprehensive transportation plan as well. And it was incredibly moving to hear high school students speaking to City Council. And as Bria Brown said, I'm not here to learn about City Hall. She said, I'm not here for some kind of a class project. I'm here because this is real for me. This was one of her friends. We recently held a rally for safe streets in partnership with a group of these high school students who formed a pedestrian advocacy coalition. And 3 years into our advocacy for a safer street along the corridor that she was crossing, we've learned an important lesson, and that is that money does not always change things. So we had the funding for this street, and we've had it in place for several years, but even when you take into account the tragic death of this teenage girl, we have not been able to accumulate the political will to change the street until the local elected leadership changed. We had a new city council member come into office. She was connected with this high school community, and she immediately became an advocate for this street to get a safety lane reconfiguration and slow down the speeds. So that's just one project that we spent 3 years pushing just to get it approved onto a list. So we've realized through this that if we're going to have to fight street by street, every single street throughout our city, we're an 8-person organization, we're small, we can't do it. There's no way we're going to win. When you have a compelling case like that, Alexia's father actually testified at every single public meeting about that street project. And he said, to quote, "If this street had been changed, my daughter would not have lost her life." So when you have that kind of powerful statement being made and no changes happening, you realize that you have to go up a level. And so we realized that we needed to do something that was way easier than win on a single street. We needed to change the hearts and minds of every single person in the city of Atlanta. And so the way that we've gone about this, that was supposed to be funny. That's impossible. No one can do that. But little by little, if you change a few hearts and a few minds, you really can make a lot of progress. And so we started this program when Bike Share was launched in our city. So it was originally around community engagement with Bike Share, and really Bike Share being for all of us, starting with the neighborhoods and communities that were the most marginalized and had been the most likely to have been displaced by past transportation projects. So the Atlanta Bike Champions project, this was inspired by a group in LA. They said, if you want people to volunteer, you need to make sure that they have the financial ability to volunteer. And so this is essentially a program that hires and trains community residents to do community engagement in their neighborhoods, to do bike education in their neighborhoods. So it's really neighbors talking to neighbors. Another way that we've been going about changing hearts and minds and shifting the culture around how we view our streets is an open streets initiative called Atlanta Streets Alive. And there's the obligatory Coca-Cola reference in the photo, in case anyone is keeping track. So I'm going to show you a couple of pictures from Atlanta Streets Alive, and this was inspired by my time in Bogota, Colombia, that was mentioned earlier, where I lived on one of the streets that was open every weekend. And I always say it was everyone and their grandmother, literally, out on the streets, just experiencing it in whatever way they felt like. There were no barriers or limitations. One goal of Streets Alive and Open Streets initiatives is to shift how people move in the city. So of course we had to ask how they got there. And a lot of people were driving, but a lot of people were also walking and biking and taking transit. And then you have to have fun. So of course you have to have a margarita in a bike blender. This is how we wanted people to feel. And at the end of the day, it's really about kids having access to their streets. Our streets are our largest public space. One father told me after the first Atlanta Streets Alive that he had a love-hate relationship with it, because now every single time he walked down that street with his 4-year-old, the kid insisted on that he needed to get out in the middle of that street on his bike. And it just wasn't feasible. The street wasn't safe without the open streets. So now that everyone had experienced our vision of safe, complete, vibrant streets, we're seeing some results. So going back to that funding mechanism, the city asked everyone, okay, we don't have enough money, how do you want us to spend it? 75% said spend it on complete streets. Safety was a major priority across all the communities that were surveyed, and there were a lot of requests for projects that were not on the list, but that fell into this category of complete streets. So the residents have spoken. What's next? The preliminary staff recommendation was to amplify this complete streets scenario. So while we're not getting every project built that we wanted, we are seeing the city getting the message that people do want these projects. They make a difference, and they have an impact. So I hope I've shared a little bit with you today about the role that nonprofit advocacy organizations can play. And I encourage you to support those organizations as we seek to amplify people's voices and engage new voices into these conversations. So you can support us financially, you can support us emotionally. Maybe you don't have such a great relationship with your local advocacy organization. You can try to befriend them, you can try to understand them. And I hope that together, when we're working across sectors, we can achieve more.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tabitha Decker from TransitCenter. This morning, Mayor Suarez kicked things off by acknowledging that Miami has a long way to go in terms of creating complete streets. And we've heard from speaker after speaker about how long it really takes to make progress on complete streets. And I wanted to start by asking you all, because we have so many practitioners and elected officials in the audience, to just take a moment and think for yourself, really, is Miami moving as fast as it could be on making streets that are fairer, safer, and that encourage transit and other kinds of sustainable modes? And second question for you is, are you personally doing all that you could to make that process move more quickly? Today, I want to share with you one tool that you have that you might not be fully using, which is the ability to collaborate more with outside advocates. And I want to talk to you about sort of how that has looked in my experience. Oh, no. There we go. All right, so TransitCenter is a foundation that works nationally. We both engage in advocacy and support advocacy, and we provide technical and strategic support to transit agencies and city leaders. The reason that we focus our attention there is because we have a really strong point of view about how transportation change really happens. We think that, first of all, you need really strong outside advocates who are calling for the right things. They're key because they build political courage and they make space for elected officials to really stake out ambitious goals. Those ambitious goals from elected officials is the sort of second essential component. And then finally, once you have ambitious policy commitments, you need people within agencies who are actually willing to do things differently. You need people who are going to really carry out this new way of doing things. And so I want to share some examples from our bus turnaround campaign in New York. Many of you may know that New York City's buses are the slowest in the country. They're quite unreliable, and unfortunately, for several years, they've been getting worse. So as the outside advocates in this case, we knew that we needed to first establish that there was a need for change, but we knew that we needed to move pretty quickly to promoting some practical strategies for what could actually make our buses faster and more reliable. So I just want to give you an introduction to the first three strategies that we've been promoting. The first is a redesign of our bus network to match the travel patterns of New Yorkers today. Our bus routes are largely built from streetcar networks of the early 20th century. As you can imagine, New York has changed a lot in the last 50 to 75 years, and so we knew that our bus routes needed to be adapted to match the city now. Second, people often say, well, what can you really do? The bus is stuck in traffic. How could the bus actually be an effective way of getting around? But of course, we know from cities elsewhere in the world that if you give buses priority on the streets, with bus lanes and signal priority at traffic signals, they actually need not be stuck in traffic. And third, we recognize that New York's current system of requiring riders to form a single file line and board one by one was extremely slow, and that we could speed up buses by allowing folks to board through any door and simply pay by tapping a card as they entered. Now, putting out some clear solutions for how to fix the bus is one thing. We know that we're going to have to really create some pressure to see policy change. And so we got to work right away with press conferences, quick releases, op-eds, even videos to try to generate the pressure that would be needed to get elected officials to commit to these kinds of changes. And here is where our partnership, both with agency staff and with elected allies, became really key. So anytime that we would do a release, including when we put out our initial report calling attention to the problem, we would first brief supportive elected officials and talk to our allies within the agency. Make sure that we understood the obstacles from their perspective and make sure that we at least understood where they might differ with us on solutions. One of the first things that we did to call attention to the problem was to grade every single bus route in our system. Those grades were based on speed and reliability, and we calculated them using real-time data, the same data that you find when you look at an app to see, is the bus actually coming or not. And you can imagine that if you're a planner within the agency, you might not be really excited about us giving lots of Ds and Fs to the bus service that you plan. And in fact, it was a little bit hard for some of our agency allies when we released these grades, but I think that folks recognized that the grades that we were giving were fair, that the speed targets and reliability targets that we set out actually were the right ones for the city. But it nonetheless, I think, was a little bit tough. The second thing that we did was take those route grades and create district-level grades. That was helpful for our elected leaders who really wanted to call for better bus service in their districts to be able to say, wow, buses in my district are traveling at an average of 5 miles per hour, or buses in my district are coming at really unreliable intervals. And for elected officials who weren't very interested in this problem, it gave their constituents a tool to use when contacting them. We also put out our top 10 corridors where bus lanes were needed. That's another case where prior to putting this release out, we talked to planners within the agency, really got their perspective on where bus lanes were most needed, and kind of had a dialogue so that when we released this, they were prepared. They didn't agree with us on 100% of the cases, but one of the things that our list led to was the transit agency sharing their own list of top 10 corridors with the Department of Transportation, which actually controls the streets. So from our perspective, a really good outcome. We did something similar with transit signal priority. That's simply the use of technology to keep buses from being stopped at red lights. Now, we had heard from our allies within the Department of Transportation that the transit agency's slow procurement process was holding up their ability to work together to implement this really straightforward solution for buses. So we testified in front of the transit agency board, got them to expedite procurement, and then our allies within the Department of Transportation were suddenly faced with having the ball back in their court and having us start to advocate for them to move more quickly on actually planning for the use of this technology. Finally, all-door boarding, that was something that we knew from our conversations with allies in the agency was going to be our heaviest lift. The main benefits that they saw were to passengers, and at that time, agency leadership wasn't so attuned to benefits for passengers. And so we developed a strong ally in the transit union. Bus drivers very supportive of all-door boarding because it makes them safer, removes them from that fare payment interaction. So we had some great press events with them, and ultimately were able to get a policy commitment from the transit agency on all-door boarding. Now, along the way, as our allies within the transit agency and Department of Transportation have made positive steps, we've always been careful to celebrate their progress. So a couple of years ago, when New York City Transit broke up an overly long bus route, a route that was known to be unreliable, we put out a short video. Sometimes breakups are for the best. It had a Valentine's Day theme because they had made the change around Valentine's Day. And really, that was intended to both celebrate them making that difficult move because there was some public opposition, and also intended to give them a tool to help explain why this change was beneficial to the public. We've had a really great year in terms of progress on this campaign. So back in April 2018, new New York City Transit President Andy Byford committed to a full redesign of the New York City bus network and to adopting a policy of boarding through all doors when the Metro card is replaced in the coming years. And then just last month, we celebrated Mayor de Blasio's commitment to speed up New York City buses by 25% by the end of 2020. It's an extremely ambitious goal. It really means that our work is far from over. We now shift to being both a supportive outside ally in a similar way to before, while also needing to serve as a watchdog and make sure that these changes both happen and happen in a way that benefits riders. I wanted to close by saying that if you think that Miami could use some of this very same productive outside advocacy, that I have good news for you. Some of you might have seen Transit Alliance outside this morning. As someone who's following transit advocacy nationally, I would say that you have one of the most effective and strategic transit advocacy organizations in the country getting started here. And so for planners and policymakers, I really encourage you to get in touch with them, to ask them for briefings. If your planner is working quietly within the agency, get a coffee with one of them. I think that if you work together, you can really accelerate progress on complete streets. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. Hi. That's me. I was asked to discuss simple topic, right? The process of creating a complete streets policy with an equity framework in a struggling and entrenched city, as well as innovative ways of securing funding. Come on, work now. I was also asked to do it in 8 minutes. And say what you want about millennials and technology. I'm 37 years old, and I've never made a PowerPoint presentation before. So what this maybe lacks in finesse, it will make up for in ambition. 7.5 minutes and 35 slides to go. At the end of 2014, as I decided to run for office with zero experience, I decided maybe I needed to know what was going on around me. There were plans to replace this 108-year-old bridge 4 blocks from my house, directly across the street from my grade school, in the same neighborhood where I grew up and where my parents still live. Nobody in the community was happy about the design. It had 4 lanes of travel planned on it and no safe facilities for cyclists and pedestrians. Community had asked for these things but had not been heard. Then I was like, what else is going on in the city? And I went to a hackathon where folks were talking about how we could better get kids to school. 40% of Baltimore City public schools and kids were missing more than a month of school each year. And the number 2 reason they attributed that to was transportation. The number 1 was asthma, which I also directly attribute to our transportation environment. The case study was a student traveling 2 to 3 hours round trip daily just to get to school. So here's what I learned from these 2 things. People are not being heard, and people's needs are not being met. There's a correlation between how we design space and who gets to use it safely. We can hardly expect to be able to educate a kid if we can't even get them to the school. Access equals opportunity. People care enough to speak up, so we should be able to address this. A friend of a friend who I met at a party brought me this pamphlet. I made this bit.ly short URL for you to copy down so that you can go online and take a look at this. I met her at a party, and she called me one day. It was raining, and she said, "What are you doing right now?" And I said, "I'm at a cafe trying to figure out how to run for office." And she said, "I'll be there in 10 minutes. I only have a minute. I'm just going to run in and run out." And I still have the copy she gave me of this. I couldn't find it, but I have it somewhere around my office. It's wrinkled from the rain because she ran into this cafe, and she said, "I can hardly believe you are serious about running for office. But if you're even half serious, then I expect you'll be speaking to a lot of people in the coming months. You're a straight, white, cis dude. You should read this." It reinforced the idea that policy that doesn't deliberately account for racial equity will invariably further racial inequity. I beg of all of you to look into this and other resources like it. I don't know if Secretary Fox is still in here. I took out a couple slides here to try to make it a little shorter, but this is where I talked about the Smart Cities Challenge and the Opportunity Collaborative in Baltimore. That was the basis for everything I did as a candidate and have done as an elected official. I ran my campaign on the idea that housing, employment, and transportation are the basic foundation of livability. That if we don't address the disparity of opportunity and access in these areas, then we won't have a shot. Well, that's presenting oddly. Then we won't have a shot at better outcomes in these other areas, and that our disparity exists because we've allowed it to. That we've allowed policy to be driven by racism throughout our history, especially in Baltimore. Baltimore was a pioneer in this. You saw a similar map in Secretary Fox's presentation. 26 years, though, before this 1937 redlining map, Baltimore passed the country's first racial zoning law. We passed another one some years later before they were struck down. Fast forward, we have what a professor at Morgan State, an HBCU in the district that I represent, dubs the white L and the black butterfly. Race and racism determine the availability of resources, access, and opportunity in every respect. Housing, you see that black butterfly and you see that L coming right down the middle of it. Employment, that's what transportation looks like. This is what everything looks like in Baltimore City. While history makes clear that our disparity is the outcome of our own deliberate policy making, over time, Baltimore stopped being a policy leader. Here's from a Baltimore blogger, an AIA fellow named Klaus Philipson, about the 2016 U.S. Conference of Mayors. He went there and learned that nobody looks at Baltimore as a leader in anything. So I decided to address all of these things in a complete streets ordinance. People not being heard, their needs not being met, disparate outcomes, nobody looking at Baltimore as a leader in any respect, and constituents that don't see the city council as a legislative body or understand how public policy shapes our lives, our cities, our outcomes. Those last couple of points I think are important because it's unrealistic to think that we'll reverse the disparity of 100 years of policy-rooted problems simply by throwing some program-based solutions at them. We actually have to make policy changes in order to fix policy-rooted problems. The policy has to be the backbone of how we allocate resources in our programming. And two, we need the public in on it. We need to be having big, difficult conversations and bringing everybody in on it. We can't afford just to be fighting for a bike lane here and there, like we just heard about. Our future depends on us thinking and acting at a much larger scale than that. And political careers are made on getting credit for things. So I think that's really important when we're talking about encouraging elected officials. Like we, to some degree, have to be thinking about what are they seeing for themselves in it. I mean, it's a cynical aspect of this, but the reality is there were already people in Baltimore working on housing equality, and there were already people working on jobs and income inequality. I just saw that nobody was paying attention to transportation and ran with it. So we have to take stock. What do we actually have the power to do? Baltimore doesn't own or operate its transportation system. It's not unique in that respect. But 30% of Baltimore, the black butterfly, lacks access to transportation. In every single historically redline community in Baltimore City, the rate of vehicle non-access is above 50%, and nowhere else except for redline communities that you saw in that 1937 map. And in every single one of them, there are census tracts with vehicle non-access of 70 and 80%. You don't see census tracts like that anywhere outside of historically redline communities in Baltimore. We need to do what we can despite our limitations. We do own and operate our roads. Our roads could be more equitably reflecting our population's needs, and so we must require that they do so. We wrote a really awesome policy paper on how to do it. Yay. Lots of people read it, I assure you. We built a pretty awesome coalition. A lot of the folks that we always hear about, AARP and American Heart Association, but also community associations and regional partners. And we built a website, BaltimoreCompleteStreets.com. You can read that policy paper if you go to it. And this is the really important part, is that we built a coalition of folks, a core group of folks. It wasn't huge, but it was a core group of folks that were willing to be messengers, and more importantly, willing to show up and have the really hard conversations about race, about culture and communications, how to speak to one another. This is something we have to continue to allow ourselves to grow in. These are the most challenging and important matters to discuss when we're talking about making big, bold policy changes with entrenched mindsets all around us. I did probably hundreds of meetings myself and presentations, and there are places that I'm not the guy that should be doing the talking. Somebody else, because of existing relationships or for cultural reasons or even professional standing, is often a better fit. You have to have coalitions and good partnerships built on trust and communication through communications that take time. Shifting a culture of thought is really hard. And so that's the most important point that I want to make. When we finally passed the bill, it was unanimous in the City Council and without any weakening amendments at all. Along the way, we educated a lot of people and converted a lot of people into understanding transportation's role in our society, its history, and that access and equity are social justice issues that touch on every aspect of our lives. What most made that possible was simply being willing to talk about it. But let's say you're not from Baltimore. Not everybody's going to be won over by social justice-based justification. No matter who you are, if you're an elected official or policymaker, you want to know what you're voting for or being asked to support and approve. So this is what's actually in that bill: fiscal prudence, transparency, equity, community engagement, accountability, safety. These are things that pretty much everybody can get behind. Those are the hard and fast requirements in the bill, what the bill actually demands. These are the other aspirational outcomes. Attractive public spaces, health and well-being for all people, safety, security, comfort, access, and convenience of all users, economic development, actively pursuing the elimination of health, economic, and access disparities. This stuff all sounds great, especially compared to this. But how are you going to pay for it? This is from a bagel shop near me. I love Greg's Bagels. They're the best. It's not in my district, though. I can't go there that often. Legislating is one thing, but implementation is another matter entirely. Baltimore needs an ordinance because despite having a resolution that we've had in place since 2010, a bicycle master plan since 2014, a separated lane network plan since 2016, and lots of lip service to commitment, we've been making little to no progress. Even since the passage of this ordinance just a few months ago, our DOT director zeroed out bicycle infrastructure funding requests in our 2020 capital budget. So I think we're just going to have to legislate that also. And so that's what I'm going to talk about here as a kind of a funding mechanism. Look, we can all say, go after this organization's grant money, this organization's grant money. It's good if we can get it. But at the end of the day, I like taxes over philanthropy. I think that's how we make a difference. And this is how we put our money where our mouth is. Our money where our mouths are, right? So in 2020, what I'm going to be doing over the next year is working to create a transportation fund for Baltimore City that takes all of the money. And he's not in here anymore, but I just want to say Secretary Fox's presentation was so good. ending on climate is like this is really where we need to be thinking. We have to be thinking really big about the intersection of transportation and health and economy and our climate and every aspect of our futures. Land use, right? All of these things are intimately related to one another. And so what I'm going to be doing over the next year is working to capture every single dollar that would not exist if not for our use of single occupancy vehicles. Capture all of that money and say it can't go anywhere except for Baltimore City's Department of Transportation, and a huge chunk of it is going to have to go to actual infrastructure for other modes of transportation other than cars. Right now, $240 million. Right now, Baltimore is capturing $240 million in revenues that we're milking from the harmful use of single occupancy vehicles, but our Department of Transportation only ever sees $190 million of that. $50 million of that is going somewhere else, most likely the most corrupt and unaccountable police department in the United States. Of that $190 million, none of it is going to infrastructure for alternate modes of transportation. If we take 20% of that $240 million, think of what we can do with almost $50 million every year for a city of 92 square miles like Baltimore City. That's what I'm working on for 2020. I think that taxation is the most important form of creative funding for projects like this. Thank you.
Can you speak to how can we ensure an equity-driven prioritization process during the implementation of Complete Streets?
Write it into legislation. Require it. Make sure that departments can't get away with less than prioritization on the basis of equity. Right now, I couldn't tell you how Baltimore decides. I'm a city elected official. I'm one of 14 city council members in the city. There's only above me, there's only a mayor and a city council president. I couldn't tell you what the decision-making process is for how we decide who gets money spent in their community and to prioritize what needs, wants, desires. Our Complete Streets ordinance requires that our Department of Transportation, much like I have to give so many props to the Chicago Complete Streets Manual, it's an amazing, amazing model. That combined with their Vision Zero manual have everything that you need. And that's what I basically try to do is put these things together. And part of what that includes is just laying out a grid, a graph that shows you what not only is your project delivery process, but how did you decide that? And in there, we require in Baltimore, in our Complete Streets ordinance, that equity be a consideration in that process.
Totally agree with prioritizing improvements in underserved areas. And then before you come up with a solution, go, listen, hear from people about what their challenges are, and then make a plan together.
Echoing the point about not knowing who the final decision maker is on a lot of these things, we're working on creating a Department of Transportation that will have an accountable person at its top who can base all of their decisions on equity and safety. That's our goal. Right now, we've asked the mayor's office to write an equity supplement to the feasibility study to create this department, because the initial feasibility study that talked about how we need a transportation department for the city didn't mention equity a single time on a single page. And so that kind of oversight is really problematic. And I think we're still at the point where too many people confuse equality, equal distribution of resources with equity.
Okay. We've seen an increasing number of communities that are finding practical ways to integrate arts and culture in terms of that being part of being an inclusive Complete Streets. Can you just address about some of the opportunities for innovative collaboration with artists and designers and engineers? And how have you seen this emerge in terms of the creation of culture Complete Streets?
We have a local historian in one of our historically black communities in the West End in Atlanta who leads walking tours of his community, and he is one of the most vocal advocates for safe and complete streets because of what he's seen on these tours. And the West End is also home to a number of artists that are known throughout the country. So I think when you engage artists in these kind of things, they come up with really creative ways to bring new people into the conversations. We also have a partnership with a local organization called Living Walls that creates street art, and they hire local artists to really transform all these blank canvases throughout the city. And so their Open Streets project, and they're really changing the way we think about the streets that we're interacting with when we open them up to people. That means also leaving behind something that's a commentary on the kinds of streets that we're trying to create.
Any other comments? Just a reminder, with a road diet on high-capacity roads.
You don't. No, I don't know. It's really hard. You know how I did it? I got $400,000 allocated for a couple of blocks in my district last year. I did it after a year and a half of asking our Department of Transportation just to at least entertain the subject, and them being unwilling to have even a reasonable conversation, neither would the mayor's office. So I went around them. I went to our state elected officials and had them earmark the money coming to the city in our highway user revenue from the state. Let me tell you how much our mayor and DOT director liked that. But we got it. We're going to have a road diet with complete streets elements. The nice thing about earmarking money from the state is it's got to be spent before the end of the fiscal year, so they don't have time to dilly-dally, or else they get egg on their face when you say, I brought you $400,000, what did you do with it?
We had a scenario recently where there were two really similar streets that were being resurfaced with state money, and on one of the streets, the local city council member got a group of residents from every single neighborhood that street touched together, and she invited them to reimagine the corridor. So 6 months later, there were multiple fatal crashes. One was a woman driving a minivan, one was a woman trying to cross the street in a half-mile stretch of this corridor. So the local residents that she'd been engaging were really upset about this, and it resulted in a road diet and a safety project by the state DOT. Parallel situation, exact same land use, really similar corridor, also a state route. The local elected official thought it was really important that the street be resurfaced so that people could drive on the really smooth pavement. So that street stayed exactly the same, and it has the same number of crashes that we had before. So I think the support of local elected officials and their willingness to listen to their constituents and hear all of their constituents, especially when there are such serious issues at stake, is the way to get that done.
So Tabitha, I think you mentioned earlier how for funders to consider financial and emotional support for nonprofit advocacy organizations, or was that Rebecca? Okay, well, you both can answer that question. What can other funders, do to support, whether it's getting to the action of policy adoption, but also post-policy, and making sure that the implementation is equity-driven and inclusive? Just, obviously that's a selfish kind of question as a funder, but, how do we get into this space, and where do you think the opportunities are for funders like us?
Yeah, well, I think there's a huge opportunity for funders to support grassroots groups who are working on complete streets and on transit. And I think that there's just a greater need to recognize how essential this kind of improvement really is for equity in the world. And so there's just I would say a lack of funding attention to these issues. And while there is some funding, I think groups that are interested in health equity, groups that are interested in social justice, should really be paying attention to transit and complete streets in a way that they aren't yet.
I would recommend that all funders read a blog called Nonprofit AF. It's got some amazing posts about is that okay to say up here? About the ways that foundations can be more flexible in supporting real systemic change. And what I've seen is that foundations that can be a little bit more open-ended with their grant making, what Ryan said earlier about we're not going to fix this kind of thing through funding a couple of programs here and there, and it's completely unrealistic to expect that we would. We have to fund it through systemic change and give multi-year grants. If you don't do anything else, give multi-year grants. Mm-hmm. Changing a system in 1 year, I challenge any of you to do it with any amount of money. You need more than 1 year. These things take time.
Awesome. So any last words to the group, only because I'm getting the cue here. We would be hearing that little music that they do at the Oscars, towards the end when you've gone too long. But any last minute thoughts that you want to share?
I kind of gave a glib answer a minute ago about funding for road diets. I want to just say, I got the state to earmark money, but I did it by making a hard sell, saying that this is what's good for our communities. That all over Baltimore City, we had historic streetcar routes that we transformed into car-centric corridors, and then we saw our Main Street commercial corridors decline because of that. Businesses won't come to them. And these are all over Baltimore City, in and out of the downtown. They're like spokes on a wheel. And the pitch that I made was that if we can demonstrate that one of these highways that tear through communities, four lanes, 2 in each direction, these stroads, if we can transform one strode into something that better serves the community's interests rather than commuting, we can show what all of them can do. We need a proof of concept, and that's the pitch that I made, and that's, I think, what we're all fighting for when we're talking about, like, what's this project going to do? We should all be talking about proof of concept, because it exists all around the country and around the world. We need to show the concept in our communities and show that it's an effort to demonstrate a better potential of a future for all of us.
Yeah,
We can get in trouble, doesn't it?
I have a sense that we have many of the people that we need right in this room to make these changes in this region. And so I would just encourage you all to set a goal for something that you can do beyond majority planning before the next Safe Streets Summit, so that you can reflect on, kind of how you accelerated progress in this region next year.
Okay. Well, join me in thanking our set of panelists.